Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Not sure who's here yet because only one person has identified themselves. Nevertheless, though, I will start. So, here is a piece from Common Dreams. Let's see if you're seeing that yet. You are seeing that. Good. But some Congress people, smiling, happy, that was probably the Inflation Reduction Act. Carolyn Maloney, looks like. Yes. After U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi signed the Inflation Reduction Act, they were very jubilant. That was on August 12th, 2022. And the title of the article is Progressives Say New Midterm Poll Must Be, quote, wake up call, unquote, to Democrats. Quote, Democrats should close the election with a clear argument about who is prepared to fight for the working class, said one strategist. This one is by Julia Conley, October 17th, 2022. With new polling showing that Republicans have gained a significant advantage in the upcoming midterm elections, progressives on Monday said Democrats must spend the next 3 weeks laser focused on the U.S. economy and their plans to end price gouging and rein in corporate power to help working people. And the New York Times Siena College poll showed that 49% of likely voters now plan to support Republican candidates, while 45% favor Democrats. In September, the same poll showed Democrats with a 1-point lead. So the first thing to note about this is that there was a 5-point swing in favor of the Republicans in 1 month. That is strange. In fact, it makes me kind of distrust this poll a little because I don't remember anything happening between, let's say, the 10th or 11th of September and the 10th or 11th of October that could have caused a 5-point shift over to the Republicans. Now, maybe it was the brilliance of their campaigning, or maybe their issues, but I kind of suspect it was probably the margin of error in this poll. But it was seized upon by progressives here in this article by Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, who said, quote, this poll should be a wake-up call for our party, said Ro. Independent voters, particularly, have swung towards Republican candidates, with 51% now saying they would support a Republican. In September, Democrats had a 3-point lead with independents. Now, this, of course, is badly stated because just off those two sentences, we don't know how much of a shift there was, okay, in 1 month. All we know is Democrats had a 3-point lead, but we don't know what to compare the 51% to. Okay, if the Democrats had only 46%, oh, I wasn't about to make sense there. So I'm just going to say there's not enough information to say how much of a shift there was in that month from Democrats to Republicans, because they don't say how much of a lead the Republicans have now at 51%. Despite outrage over the right-wing majority of the U.S. Supreme Court's June ruling, which overturned Roe v. Wade and paved the way for at least 13 states to outlaw abortion care, women who identify as independent voters showed the largest shift toward Republicans in the past month. Now, why in heaven's name would that be the case? It's hard to tell. The independent women favored Democrats by 14 points in September, and now they support Republicans by a margin of 18 points. Now, what could have happened between September and October to cause a shift of 32 points in independent women? That's very fishy, folks. Very fishy, in my view. Now, the newest poll data was gathered between October 9th and October 12th, with 792 likely voters. Now, that tells me something. This is not a New York State poll. This is supposed to be a national poll. 792 likely voters who were sampled sounds to me like a very small number for a national poll. It's usually the case that you'd want at least 1,000 people in your sample for a national poll. So you sort of wonder whether 792 likely voters is really enough to allow statistical inference in this case. Well, President Joe Biden has recently unveiled policies that have the support of a majority of Americans, including his decisions to pardon people with federal marijuana possession offenses and to cancel some student debt for certain borrowers. Voters reported that they plan to make their decisions in November based on the rising cost of living and inflation. So Biden, of course, is trying to do something about that. He's trying to release more oil from the reserve, the strategic oil reserve, so that by election day, the cost of living has gone down somewhat because the cost of gas has gone down somewhat. So he's hoping to get some help there. How much of a difference that would make, I do not know. In July, 36% of likely voters said economic concerns were primarily guiding them to support or oppose candidates, compared with 44% now. So economic concerns have gotten much more important since July, and we can probably infer since the decision of the Supreme Court. Respondents who were focused on the economy were more than twice as likely to support Republicans than Democrats. As Democratic leaders, candidates, and strategists review the data, Khanna said, they must consider progressive lawmakers' recent push, quote, for a sharper and stronger economic message, unquote. And here's a part of a table from the study. Likely voters were 45% in the Democratic camp, 49% in the Republican camp. When you break down by age, and it would be nice to know the breakdown here because these results coming up are a little strange too. In the 18 to 29-year-old bracket, Dems are ahead by 12 points, 52 to 40. And in the 30 to 44 bracket, they're ahead 50 to 41 by 9 points. So, of course, we don't know how many in that sample of, was it 792? How many in that sample were 18 to 29 years old, and how many in that sample were 30 to 44 years old? There were probably more in the 50 to 41 age bracket, because that's 14 years or 15 years. And 18 to 29 is about 11 years. Now, the third bracket shown here is 45 to 64. That shows the Republicans with an advantage of 59 to 38, 21-point advantage. You wonder why there wasn't a breakdown somewhere in the middle, so we could get a better feel of how things are changing. You also wonder why the 45 to 64 vote is so much skewed but towards the Republicans. Not sure why that would be so different from the 30 to 44 vote. 30 to 44 ages are ages where people have been around, at least somewhat. So why should there be such a big swing? In the 45 to 64, the difference in favor of the Republicans is 21 points. In the 30 to 44, there's a difference of 9 points with the Democrats ahead. So there's a huge swing. Why should the 45 to 64 be so Republican compared to the 30 to 44? I suspect that a little bit, I must say. The results also say that independent women especially are swinging to the GOP despite Democrats' focus on abortion rights. That doesn't sound right to me. That sounds fishy. Fishy. Earlier this month, Khanna introduced his new economic patriotism plan, which would push the federal government to support American-made products and materials, which could help address the current supply chain crisis. Khan and other progressives have also spoken out about price gouging by powerful oil companies that have raked in over $100 billion in profit so far this year, lavishing the money on shareholders and executives while working people struggle to afford fuel on top of groceries, housing, and other essentials. Elizabeth Warren said that giant corporations are using inflation as a cover story to jack up prices and pad profits. And she has introduced some legislation to empower federal regulators to stop companies from price gouging. Those proposals are among the subjects Democrats should be focusing on as early voting gets underway across the country, said progressives on Monday. Democrats should close the election with a clear argument about who is prepared to fight for the working class, said Mike Kaska, Director of Communications for guess who? Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont. While Democrats have unveiled proposals to stand up to wealthy corporations in recent months, Republicans have pushed plans to raise taxes on low-income households and weaken government programs relied on by millions of senior citizens, including Medicare and Social Security. Now, why aren't Democrats running on that? You don't hear that from them, do you? On Monday, the Washington Post reported that one of the top priorities for Republicans, if they retake control of Congress, would be to make permanent portions of the Trump tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefited the rich and corporations. Do people know that? Do people know that? Why has there been a swing towards the Republicans? Warren Gunnels, an advisor to Sanders, the man with the receipts, Warren Gunnels, pointed to a recent report by the pro-worker media organization More Perfect Union, which showed that a promise to provide direct cash benefits similar to the expanded child tax credit, which Republicans flatly opposed continuing this year, despite the fact that it cut childhood poverty by 30% and helped millions of families to afford basic necessities, was found to be, quote, the most popular campaign message a candidate could have. Why aren't Democrats using it? They don't appear to be using it. So their amendment to do that got one vote out of fear that it would offend two corporate Democrats, probably Sinema and Manchin. Okay. Republicans, here's a tweet by More Perfect Union. Republicans have spent $44 million on TV ads focused on the inflation and the economy since Labor Day, per by Lever News. Democrats have spent just $12 million, less than 7% of their total ad spending. Stan Greenberg argues they're making a huge mistake. I agree with Stan Greenberg. They are making a huge mistake. Huge. Y-U-G-E. Because they're not featuring this. So, Sanders has pushed Democrats in recent days to communicate clearly with voters about the danger that Republicans pose to working class Americans' finances and how the Democratic Party has worked to help the middle and lower class. Quote, I think they should contrast their views with the Republican positions, unquote, Sanders told NBC News on Sunday, repeating his argument from an earlier opinion piece in The Guardian. I believe, and most Democrats believe, that at a time when half our people are living paycheck to paycheck, we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage. No Republicans support that. I think we should make it easier for workers to join unions. Republicans don't support that. And Reverend William J. Barber III, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, agreed, on Monday, quote, you can't cede, C-E-D-E, the economic argument to folks who say the answer is to give corporations and the wealthy more money, he said. So what were the Democrats doing? What have the Democrats been doing? What kinds of mistakes are they making? Well, the next piece is going to speak to that some. So let us pull that piece in and go further with this narrative that we are developing. Hey, Steve Wolfbrat, nice to see you again. Nice to see you, Kay. Well, it seems that whatever the Democrats have been doing, they haven't been countering the effects of corporate media and their propaganda. A Common Dreams article is entitled, How Corporate Media Help GOP Spread Inflation Misinformation. And this article is by Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. And Dean, his work is very familiar to me, generally very good work, says the media have been hyping inflation pretty much nonstop for the last year and a half. They tell us this is the only thing people care about. They don't care about whether they have a job, how much the job pays, whether they have health care, or any other economic issue. People care about inflation, full stop. That's Dean being sarcastic. And what do you know? This is bad news for Joe Biden and the Democrats, Dean says. Yeah, it's true that pretty much every other wealthy country in the world is facing a comparable rate of inflation, but that doesn't matter. We have high inflation, and it's Joe Biden's fault. The Democrats just have to accept this. The insistence that inflation is the only economic issue voters care about reminds me of the situation a quarter century ago when there was a big push by Republicans and many Democrats to cut and or privatize Social Security. The story at the time was that Social Security faced a crisis and something had to be done. The liberal position, quote unquote, was that it was best to get out front and propose more modest cuts, which would hit the middle class while protecting the poor. The concern for the poor was nice, but the fact is that most middle-income people rely on Social Security for most of their retirement income. It is hard to say that the benefits that now average just over $1,600 a month are all that generous. There is not much room for cutting without serious hardship. At the time, my longtime colleague and friend Mark Weisbrot, he and Dean both founded the Center for Economic Policy Research. And I questioned whether people really saw Social Security as being in crisis. We knew that's what all the political experts said. I even remember being in a meeting with one of the leading Democratic pollsters who was very adamant on this point. He recounted his experiences in focus groups where if you told people Social Security was not in crisis, they got angry to the point they wanted to throw things at you. This all struck Mark and me as very strange. After all, how could people become convinced Social Security was in a crisis? With tens of millions of people reading through the Social Security Trustees Report and studying other long range projections of demographics and economic growth, that didn't strike us as very likely. It seemed more plausible that people thought Social Security was in crisis because everyone they heard talk about it on TV or the radio said Social Security was in crisis. If that is all you ever hear about Social Security, then you might come to believe the program is in crisis. Thankfully, we got through this period without any cuts to Social Security. Mark and I made a minor contribution to preserving the program with our book, Social Security, The Phony Crisis. What does this have to do with inflation? The reason for bringing up this history with Social Security is that the political dynamics around the inflation debate are very similar to the dynamics around Social Security in the 1990s. The media constantly assert that inflation is the only economic issue that people care about, and Republicans are happy to go along with this assertion, and Democrats are intimidated into silence. It's so easy to intimidate Democrats, isn't it, folks? But just as it was hard to believe that people had studied demographic and economic trends in order to determine that Social Security faced a crisis, it is also hard to believe that people only care about inflation. After all, it was not ancient history when we had more than 10 million people unemployed. In fact, that was true in January of 2021, the month President Biden took office. The unemployment rate is now down to 3.5%, a half century low. Doesn't the opportunity to have a job mean anything to people? After all, most people who are working do need a job to pay the bills. There is also the issue of job quality. While many people are still in low paying jobs doing unpleasant work, the tight labor market has meant that millions of workers have been able to quit jobs that they don't like. In the last year, there were 51.5 million voluntary quits from jobs. This number is for total quits. Some people quit more than twice. So the actual number of people who quit jobs would be somewhat lower. The new opportunities for workers in low paying jobs has meant that wages have outpaced inflation for workers at the bottom end of the wage ladder. Real average hour earnings for production and non supervisory workers in the leisure and hospitality industry, hotels and restaurants, rose by 3.9% from February 2020 to September of this year. To be clear, these workers aren't doing well. A worker supporting a family on $20,000 a year before the pandemic will still be struggling if their real earnings increased to 20,800. But they are better off than they were in 2019. The media have largely ignored the story of workers quitting.
Sorry.
To be clear, these workers are not doing well. A worker supporting a family on $20,000 a year before the pandemic will still be struggling if their real earnings increase to 20,800. But they're better off than they were in 2019. The media have largely ignored the story of workers quitting bad jobs for ones that pay better and or offer better working conditions. It's not just workers at the bottom who are doing better today than they were before the pandemic. Tens of millions of homeowners who were able to take advantage of the low mortgage interest rates that we had until the Fed rate hikes started. They refinanced their homes at rates that were often a percentage point or more below the rate they paid before the pandemic. That could mean 2 to 3 thousand a year in interest savings for a typical homeowner. Are we really supposed to believe that these interest savings won't cover paying $1 more for a gallon of milk at the supermarket? Obviously, no one is happy about paying higher prices for food and other items, but the families that were able to refinance are almost certainly better off today, even with higher prices than they were before the pandemic. There is a similar story with the tens of millions of people who are now able to work from home as a result of changes implemented in the workplace during the pandemic. These people are saving thousands of dollars a year in commuting costs. Are we really supposed to believe these people are all worse off due to inflation in spite of these savings? It is worth noting that the average hourly wage has almost kept pace with inflation since the start of the pandemic. It's down by just 0.7%. It dropped 3.9% during the Reagan boom. So there is not that much ground that workers need to make up through paying lower mortgage interest or savings on commuting costs. So, given the economic reality, is it plausible that everyone feels they're being devastated by inflation? That one doesn't seem to fit, just like the story that everyone believes Social Security was in a crisis back in the 1990s didn't make sense. We know politicians can't stick their necks out and say that inflation isn't that bad. The media will mercilessly trash them for being out of touch. But people whose jobs don't prevent them from telling the truth can point out what the data show. Most families are not being devastated by inflation, and that fact will not change no matter how many times the media and Republican politicians assert the opposite. So, this is interesting in light of the first piece, where that sample of 792 reported that great big shift among independent people and the great big shift, okay, in opinion, okay, in the older ages. It just doesn't compute, as this Common Dreams article says. It doesn't sound like the inflation is that serious. It also doesn't sound as though people have lost a lot to inflation that they would be so angry at it so as to support as rapid a change as that in terms of opinion. So again, I have further doubts about that the New York Times Siena poll that we're seeing. On the other hand, as someone who does hope uh, the Democrats hold on to the House and hold on to the Senate, okay, I have to say that that particular survey results or those survey results may be actually good, because if they're wrong, it still spurs the Democrats to work harder. And they're certainly going to need to work harder, whether the actual figure is that the Republicans are 4 points ahead or whether the figure is that the two parties are even, which I think is a possibility. I think that poll could be that far off. So, Uh, let's move on to another article at what's happening. This is October 14th, and this one is from the Lever News, the relatively new publication from David Sirota and his friends. So I'll share the screen for that one. Some interesting comments there, at least one interesting comment I saw. And that piece was by Andrew Perez and David Sirota, who have been together since they started to found the earlier blog, the Daily Poster, and then they changed that, to the Lever News. Anyway, this is October 14, 2022, and Dems, title is Dems Barely Messaging, on economic issues. And Republicans are spending Democrats into the ground on economic issues and inflation. That's kind of the tagline or the subtitle for the piece. There's a picture of Maggie Hassan, who's running again for the Senate, for re-election to the Senate in New Hampshire, and has a stiff challenge right now from a Republican. Of course, the reason why she may have a stiff challenge is that she was one of the 8 senators on the Democratic side who voted against reinserting the $15 an hour figure for the minimum wage when the American Rescue Plan was passed. If you recall, it had $15 in it to start with. That was stripped out of the bill by Chuck Schumer. Bernie Sanders made an attempt to do an amendment of the bill that hit the floor that would reinsert the $15 an hour. And Maggie Hassan was one of the 8 really stupid Democratic senators who voted against reinserting that in. And to my mind, she deserved to lose just because of that. I mean, did she really think people in New Hampshire were going to be against her if she voted for inserting $15 an hour back into the bill? Somehow, I sincerely doubt that. I know they're conservative in New Hampshire, but they ain't that conservative. Even as polling shows Americans' top concern in the upcoming midterm is the economy, Democrats have barely amplified any message on the issue in their midterm House and Senate advertising campaigns, according to new data reviewed by the Lever. Republican candidates and political groups have spent $44 million on TV ads focused on the economy and inflation since Labor Day, according to a tally from Ad Impact, which tracks campaign spending throughout the country. In the same period, Dems have spotlighted these issues in just $12 million worth of ads, less than 7% of the party's total ad spending during that time. The party has put another $18 million into ads that mention jobs and infrastructure, but overall, Democrats are significantly outspending them on messaging around economic issues. The takeaway is clear. Caught between a bad economy and not wanting to offend big donors, Democrats have not aired a unified populist message hammering the business profiteering, fueling inflation. Instead, they have spent much of their resources, $67 million, on ads related to abortion rights, a topic of heightened significance after the repeal of Roe v. Wade, but one that does not raise the ire of their corporate sponsors nor generate as much interest from midterm voters this year, according to recent survey data. The lack of focus from Democrats on the economy and inflation comes as recent polls from the Washington Post and Monmouth University found that the top two most important issues among voters are the economy and inflation, far outpacing the abortion rights issue. According to the Post poll, 54% of voters say they trust Republicans more than Democrats to handle the economy, compared to 37% who say they trust Democrats more on the issue. In 2020, voters were evenly split on whom they would trust to better handle the economy between President Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The discordance between voters' economic anxiety and Democrats' ads is so acute that even one of the party establishment's own voices recently spoke up to sound an alarm. Quote, "While abortion is an extraordinarily important issue that has galvanized many voters and shaken up the midterms," tweeted David Axelrod, a Democratic consultant who architected the anti-populist politics of Obama. Quote, "But it isn't the only issue, and Democrats who are relying on it as a silver bullet may come up short," unquote, falling even further behind. The focus of Americans on the economy in the midterm should come as no surprise, given that the government figures show workers are facing the harshest cost of living conditions in a quarter century, and a staggering number of Americans are having trouble paying their bills. Quote, "A majority of workers are finding their wages falling even further behind inflation," said a recent study by the Federal Reserve, issuing an uncharacteristically loud warning for the typically muted bank. Quote, "While the past 25 years have witnessed episodes that show either greater incidence or larger magnitude of real wage declines, the current time period is unparalleled in terms of the challenge employed workers face." The latest survey data from the Census Bureau similarly found that more than 40% of U.S. households say it's now very or somewhat difficult to pay their household expenses. That figure has increased 50% since spring of 2021, when the government began cutting off COVID-19 pandemic aid. Inflation has significantly accelerated since then, and Americans are experiencing higher prices everywhere in their daily lives. In the past year, the cost of health insurance has increased a record 28%. Rent has increased 7%, and groceries have increased by 13%. I really have to say, I have trouble accounting for the idea that health insurance prices have increased by a record of 28%, simply on the basis that inflation in oil, which is basically starting this, why would that have an effect on the cost of health insurance? Did they use a lot of oil in the health insurance industry? Why the increase by a record 28%? Could it be that in the health insurance industry, there's nobody regulating or stopping price gouging, and that 28% is due to price gouging? Gee, you would think that groceries would have increased by a tremendous amount. They have increased by 13%. But I'll tell you the truth, I wouldn't be surprised if it was groceries that increased by 28% and health insurance that increased by 13% or by 7%. So I don't really understand these figures without recourse to an explanation that in one industry, the health insurance industry, it's particularly easy to price gouge consumers. It's less easy in rent because they complain more. And of course, in groceries, you take what you can get. You can't really control it very much. Although gasoline prices have cooled since summer highs, they've still increased 18% since last year, and utility gas prices are up 33%. The Fed has hiked interest rates 5 times this year with the express intent of driving down wages. Fed Chair Jay Powell, who was appointed by Donald Trump and renominated by Joe Biden. So let me ask a common sense question here. Fed Chair Jay Powell is a Republican. He was appointed by Donald Trump. Is it really a surprise that he wants to drive down wages? Is it really a surprise? Why did Joe Biden renominate him? Why didn't he nominate someone like Sarah Raskin? I think her name is Sarah. She's the wife of Jamie Raskin, okay, a congressman, and a rather sensible economist. Who cares about people? Sarah Bloom Raskin is what it is. I'm sorry. Why did Joe Biden want to renominate a Republican as the Fed chair? Weren't there any perfectly good people, from the Democratic side? Like, for example, Lyle Brainard would have been another one. She wouldn't have been as good as Raskin, but she would have been a hell of a lot better than Jay Powell when it came to wanting to drive down wages by raising interest rates. I mean, that's a Republican move and fits Jay Powell's identity as a Republican. Biden screwed up. It's not clear how the Fed's actions will drive down the cost of basic necessities like rent, food, or health insurance. In fact, higher interest rates may be exacerbating the housing crisis. Thanks to the rate hikes, we are facing these higher costs with reduced labor power and declining wages as inflation continues to get worse. If the Fed keeps increasing rates, it will inevitably lead to higher unemployment too. Meanwhile, corporations continue to enjoy record profits, which has been the primary driver of inflation all along. That, of course, is very, very true. That's been the primary driver all along, and the Biden administration will not fight that with the windfall profits tax, will not fight it with regulations on those businesses that are recording very high profits, will not fight it with price controls on those corporations. In other words, he won't really do anything that's effective to control inflation. Having controlled both Congress and the White House during the past 2 turbulent financial years, at first glance, it might seem like Democrats are being wise to avoid focusing on the economy. But in truth, they don't have to go silent on inflation. On the contrary, some Democratic candidates and groups have shown they can craft compelling messages on the issues in their ads. Pennsylvania Senate candidate John Fetterman has run an ad declaring that our economy is a mess because of Washington, the rich, powerful, the insiders, and the lobbyists. And he added, quote, they set the rules, weakened our supply chain, and spiked inflation, unquote. Senator Michael Bennet, Democrat of Colorado, says Coloradans are facing record prices while corporations are raking in record profits. I know sometimes it feels like no one is listening. That's why I'm fighting to end the billions in subsidies given to big oil. And Senate Majority PAC, a super PAC tied to Democratic Senate leaders, has funded an ad asserting that Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, has allowed oil and drug companies to jack up prices on us. But these spots are the exception rather than the rule, and they're being drowned out by the GOP's more targeted campaign. Republicans have not only poured tens of millions into ads about crime and law enforcement, they spent nearly 4 times as much as Democrats on ads about the economy and inflation. For instance, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, NRSC, the Senate's GOP's party committee, has run a series of inflation-themed ads targeting vulnerable Democrats. Quote, I'm a mother of 4 and I work part-time, quote, says an ad opposing Senator Maggie Hassan. I'm a Democrat of New Hampshire. Quote again, my big family uses a lot of gas and we buy lots of groceries. I'm overwhelmed by the rising costs my family faces every day, and that's why I can't support Senator Hassan. The ad claims Hassan sent inflation through the roof and left families like mine struggling to keep up. And this is by one Lauren Spitzberg from Manchester, New Hampshire. There's a YouTube ad on that. I'm not going to play the YouTube ad. An NRSC ad targeting Mark Kelly says he gave Joe Biden all power in Washington, Senate, White House, Congress, and it's wrecking our country. Trillions of dollars in reckless spending and inflation crushing family budgets. I wonder whether that family got the $1,400 per person stimulus. I also wonder whether they got the child tax credits for those months. Similarly, the Congressional Leadership Fund, the House GOP Super PAC, has run an ad targeting Dina Titus, who's a Democrat from Nevada, on inflation too. The Economist said excessive spending would lead to inflation, but she didn't listen, says the ad campaign, which adds, now we're paying the price, higher prices on everything, economy and recession. So that was one piece from the Lever about this, but there's another piece from the Lever about this, quite a good one. This is 3 days later, October 17th. And this was done by David Sirota alone. And let's see what David had to say. Oh, David, by the way, was Bernie Sanders' speechwriter in the 2020 campaign. And over the years has worked for Bernie 2 or 3 times, I believe. Deferring to donors, Dems ignored their cautionary tale. In 2014, the party learned pro-choice messaging can't replace economic populism. That lesson is being ignored in deference to big money. Here's a picture of Senator Udall, former Senator Mark Udall, greeting supporters at a campaign rally for his re-election bid in Denver in October 15th, 2014. Yes, I'm just checking out to see that I did share that. I did. So here's Udall on the campaign trail, really, really happy, greeting supporters at a campaign rally for his re-election bid in Denver on October 15, 2014. In 2014, Colorado hosted a U.S. Senate race that for a time became a Democratic cautionary tale, but now seems like a foreboding preview of Democrats' 2022 national campaign amid the smoldering wreckage of the financial crisis. Senator Mark Udall based his campaign message almost exclusively on his defense of abortion rights in a race against anti choice Republican Cory Gardner. Udall was unfairly vilified by the national local press for his laser focus. Ultimately, the Denver Post editorial board endorsed Gardner, insisting the right wingers' election would pose no threat to abortion rights. Famous last words. And declaring that Udall's, quote, obnoxious one issue campaign is an insult to those he seeks to convince, unquote. Two things ended up being true at the same time. It was true that despite the advantages of both incumbency and a respected surname, Udall lost the race because he was perceived to be a one-issue candidate who had ignored the 1992 Clinton campaign's mantra, quote, it's the economy, stupid, unquote. It was also true that Udall was right that his loss would threaten reproductive rights. Indeed, despite the Denver Post's assurances to the contrary, Gardner went on to cast pivotal Senate votes to appoint 3 of the right-wing Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. At the time, the moral of the story seemed clear. Democrats may lose winnable elections in tough economic times if they're not willing to break with their big donors and offer a populist economic message promising to fix the problem these donors are creating. Without that kind of economic message, they may lose even if they're right about conservative social issue extremism. But 8 years later, that lesson has been memory hold as America faces the same scenario at a much bigger scale. As the Lever recently reported, Democrats confronting a pivotal election in another economic crisis are spending tens of millions of dollars on ads about abortion while spending far less on ads addressing inflation or the economy, the two issues that a bevy of recent polls show voters are most worried about. Other data tell the same story. The Wesleyan Media Project found that inflation has been mentioned in nearly 40% of television ads pushing GOP House candidates, but it hasn't even ranked among the top issues being mentioned in ads pushing Democratic House candidates. And it is not as if Democrats are making up the gap online. Democratic groups are bankrolling lots of abortion-related ads on Facebook, but barely spending anything on economy-focused messages. The result of that silence, survey data now show many voters do not think Democrats can be trusted on or even care very much about the inflation crisis that is defining the election. I have to add here, this is not just a matter of the ads that have been running. It's also a matter of what Biden has not done, specifically price controls, windfall profits tax, tighter regulation on companies making huge profits. He would not do that. Had he done that, inflation would be far less than it is today. And moreover, the Democrats would have something to talk about when inflation became the subject. Going on anyway. First bullet point. The latest New York Times Siena poll shows that 44% of likely voters say inflation and the economy are the most important issues facing the country. Just 5% say abortion is the most important issue. The poll shows, to me, actually, abortion is the most important issue, but that's just me. The survey results tell you what people feel about that, though, as I mentioned before, that survey may be flawed in certain ways, but it's not so flawed. It's not so flawed that the difference of 44% to 5% can be accounted for. And believe me, there's a big lead for the economy and inflation over abortion as the most important issue. The poll shows Republicans with a 49-45 edge when voters are asked which party they're planning to vote for in the election. The recent Washington Post ABC News poll shows voters say the economy and inflation are their top concerns in the elections, and Republicans hold a 54-35 advantage when voters are asked which party they have confidence in to combat price increases. And once again, that may well be due to the fact that Biden has done little to fight um, uh, to combat price increases. The new Harvard Harris survey shows the largest number of voters saying inflation is the most important issue facing the country, with 24% saying GOP leaders are most concerned with the issue, and only 14% saying the same about the Democratic leaders. That same poll shows 27% say Democrats are most concerned with the January 6th insurrection, a riot, he calls it here, an issue that only 7% of voters say is the most important issue facing the country. Now, I regret that very low percentage. It seems to me that that is an extremely important issue and should be at the top of the issues people are concerned with. But the facts are the facts. People worry more about their pocketbooks, putting food on the table, the basic economic issues. People care more about that than they do about democracy. They care more about that than they care about the rights of women. It's unfortunate, but okay, it's true. You should run on the rights of women. You should run on democracy. But you also got to run on the economy and inflation as well. You have to run on these three things. Yes, honey.
Gun control.
Well, Bonnie says gun control too, but I think that gun control is also much less important than economy and the inflation. And you have to run on the issues people think are the most important issues in order to get the social credit necessary to do the things that are also very important. To be sure, the details of 2022 are different from 2014, with the Supreme Court's Dobbs decisions throwing reproductive freedom to Congress and the states. The stakes for women are higher than they were back then, making the issue potentially more electorally salient than ever. Meanwhile, even a bad economy, job growth under Democrats' trifecta control of Washington is a bright spot that could somewhat buoy the party. And yet, the once famous Colorado lesson still seems all too relevant to the moment. Somehow, 2014 swing state parable about the supremacy of economic issues has been flippantly ignored in a do or die, must get it exactly right kind of election, featuring right wing fascists threatening to snuff out whatever is left of democracy. Excuse me, folks. I gotta turn off this. Uh, oh, I know where that was. That wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from Bonnie's iPad, I think. I'm not sure about that. All I know is I turned off the sound and it still appeared. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, somehow 2014 swing state parable about the supremacy of economic issues has been flippantly ignored in a do or die, must get it exactly right kind of election featuring right wing fascists threatening to snuff out whatever is left of democracy. Yeah, I know. That's why I have the same feeling. this show, of course, is empowering democracy because we have that same feeling that that issue is, in the longer run, the most important issue. Going on, David Sirota says, it's the economy, you absolute moron. What's so maddening is that even in good times, quote, it's the economy stupid, unquote, is the most reliable rule of thumb for issue focus in a campaign. But in this particularly brutal year, it should be, quote, it's the economy, you absolute moron, unquote. After all, anyone with a functioning brainstem should know that 2022 is a DEFCON 1 type of economic emergency, as evidenced by 3 new strands of data. There was the recent Dallas Federal Reserve study showing that a majority of Americans in the labor market are finding their wages falling even further behind inflation, conditions that the bank says appear to be the most severe faced by employed workers over the past 25 years. Then there was the September Census Bureau report finding more than 4 in 10 households struggling to pay the bills, a whopping 50% increase since last spring when the government began cutting off COVID-19 pandemic aid. And there were last week's reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Commonwealth Fund showing that health insurers have jacked up their prices by 24% in a single year, boosting insurance companies' profits while leaving more than 2 out of 5 Americans uninsured or underinsured. Of course, we have to notice that the earlier article that was done by Andrew Perez and David Sirota quoted a jacking up of prices of 28% in a single year rather than 24% in a single year. Whatever, both figures are astronomical. Democrats have had plenty of inflation message options they could be using to put themselves into a better position heading into the last month of the campaign. They could be blaming Republicans for blocking the extension of the expanded child tax credits that had been reducing pain, suffering, and poverty among millions of working class voters. They could simply pledge more direct economic help if they win the midterms, a popular reprise of their promise of pandemic survival checks that won them those 2 pivotal Georgia Senate races in 2020. Though maybe this time they could say clearly to people, absolutely, we're going to get you a survival check of $2,000. None of this $1,400 nonsense anymore. And saying, oh, well, Trump got you $600, so we're getting you the other $400. They could resurface their now discarded promise of a public health insurance option, or do anything other than shovel more government money at their health insurance donors that are fueling the inflation crisis. They could have forced Republicans to vote down a windfall profits tax on the fossil fuel industry and continued to force votes on legislation to crack down on energy price gouging. Then they could have put serious money behind ads spotlighting the GOP blocking those measures on behalf of their energy insurance donors who have been jacking up gasoline and electricity prices while reaping huge profits. Yeah, they could have done all of that. More broadly, Democrats could be vilifying the entire plague of greedflation, whereby corporate oligopolies are hiking prices not because their inputs are more expensive, but simply because they have the market power to fleece everyone. At absolute minimum, rather than President Joe Biden's betting on and standing by the Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell's efforts to, quote, get wages down, unquote, and crush workers in order to reduce inflation, the White House and congressional Democrats could simply demand an end to draconian interest rate hikes that do not target corporate profiteering, that are not reducing inflation, and that seem deliberately designed to induce a recession. Of course, we have to mention here that the initial effects of raising interest rates are to feed inflation, not to reduce inflation. They don't reduce inflation until they get high enough that they crash the economy. What reduces inflation is crashing the economy. But the first effect, and the effect so far in the current inflation, has been for the interest rate hikes to raise inflation. Why do they raise inflation? Because their initial effect is to get people in the economy paying higher interest rates. They raise the cost of money, and raising the cost of money has an effect on prices all over the economy. The Fed has been raising the cost of money. It's not rocket science, said longtime Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg, who again is the husband of Rosa DeLauro, who was the author of the child tax credit bills. In a recent video reviewing survey data detailing a simple and effective message that could move voters, to win in November, Democrats must win an economic argument against the Republicans, and one of the top priorities must be to inform voters that we can help working people with the high cost of living, unquote. Sacrificing liberty for something to eat is the title of the next section of this piece. But the kind of populism Greenberg refers to is anathema to the two constituencies that still call the shots in democratic politics. Many of the party's Washington elites, pundits, and thinkfluencers are Austerians who grew up in the neoliberal Reagan and Clinton eras, who venerate the anti-populism of the Obama presidency, and who still see popular New Deal style social safety net programs as odious handouts. Meanwhile, the party's donor class has a financial interest in making sure Democrats never raise uncomfortable questions about the corporate power that enriches them. That has left Democratic leaders to try to focus the election on abortion, an issue that's certainly critical in the wake of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, and one that also doesn't offend the corporations and wealthy donors that bankroll the party. That's the problem. Those donors bankrupting, bankrolling the party and bankrupting the party from a moral point of view. The problem, though, is the same one you'd all faced 8 years ago. Polls show most voters see the economy and inflation as much more pressing than any other issues. The danger here is that given the choice between a corporate party focusing on abortion but offering no economic message, and a far-right party at least offering some kind of economic analysis, however flawed, voters may choose the latter option. Indeed, as President Franklin Roosevelt said when looking out at European populations embracing fascism amid unbearable economic conditions, quote, in desperation, they chose to sacrifice liberty in the hope of getting something to eat, unquote. 1 year ago, Oscar-winning filmmaker Alex Gibney and I tried to warn about all this in a widely circulated Rolling Stone article tied to our podcast series about the last of the midterm elections, when Democrats controlled the government during an economic collapse. There was plenty of time for a course correction when we sounded that alarm, and there's still a bit of time for a turnaround. Democrats have a few weeks left to show they care about millions of people struggling to get something to eat, but the hour is getting late. If Democrats do not remember the cautionary tale from 2014, if they forget, quote, it's the economy, you moron, unquote, then everything they purport to stand for could be lost. Reproductive rights, democracy, um, everything. I have to say, I couldn't agree more with those two Lever articles. They were great. They were very hard hitting. And they focus for us in these last weeks what our dilemma is. Democrats are currently losing. They have to change strategies. They have to embrace the populist strategy for the 3 weeks that remain here. That is what has to happen. Okay, I'm going to consider a few comments, but I'm over my time here by about 15 minutes or so. And I have another stream at 9 p.m. So, of course, I have to make dinner and I have to eat dinner. So, I'm going to leave very soon. But Steve Wolbrand says my bank raised interest rate on CDs to 2.25%. The only bright spot for me, the bank, yeah, CDs go up when the Fed raises interest rates. Steve says last minute polls looking bad for Democrats. I really don't think Fetterman's damaged brain is up to the demands of that job, in my humble opinion. Well, I certainly disagree. I actually strongly disagree. I think that his damaged brain is a temporary affair, and that Fetterman, even with a damaged brain, is much better for people than Oz with his brain working in wonderful order, because Oz is evil and Fetterman, okay, is not. But Fetterman has good intentions. He has a wife to focus him, who also has very good intentions. We won't be able to tolerate, we will be extremely disappointed, the people in Pennsylvania, having to tolerate 6 years of Dr. Oz in the Senate. And that doesn't even count the party considerations. Steve Wilbrand says, I meant Citibank, but damn autocorrect. Stacy Van Veen is here. Hi, Stacy. Hey, you remember when I said Tulsi? When you said Tulsi? I don't remember. When you said Tulsi. Nobody's saying much about Tulsi anymore, though. Sandy Deck says, hello, shared. Hi, Dolores, Joe, Bonnie, Kay, and Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says, my company has raised prices steeply on all new clients. Old accounts are grandfathered in at low rates that almost not profitable for us. They should die off or sell their properties and move. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Sandy. Robin Halsey says Biden has a corporate master. Same as GOP. Dem exit. Sure, if we could all Dem exit at once, we would be able to Dem exit. Unfortunately, what you need to do is to Dem exit in the Democratic primaries, so you kill the corporates in those primaries. Then you have somebody to vote for in the general election. But the way we do things now, if we just exit at the time of the primaries, we miss being able to put someone in there who's not a corporate thief. Kay says, hi, Sandy. Stacy Van Veen says, Biden has Ted Kaufman. He's like an economic tumor. Yes, he is. He's very very economically conservative, and he is Biden's good friend, and he is the other senator from Delaware right now. In other words, one senator is Chris Coons, the other one is Kaufman, if I remember correctly. Sandy says, gives 3 hearts and a number of other icons I can't read. And Dolores says, hi, Sandy, great to see everyone. Steve Wolfbrand says, Russia threatening to cut off all diplomatic ties to the West. Nobody wins a nuclear war. Watch the movie Threads, free on YouTube. Threatening, sorry. Steve Wolfbrand, Joe, because so many people are one paycheck away from disaster. Yes, Steve, that is right. They're calling to tell you your car warranty is about to expire. I know, and I don't even have a car warranty. These fools. I guess they're doing some swindles of some kind with that. Anyway, it's time for me to go. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this. Okay, I certainly did. I'll see you at 9 o'clock. And I want to remind you that at 9 p.m., I'll be talking about interest rate terrorism, which from the title, you might be thinking that all I'm talking about is, that all that I'm talking about, okay, is the rise in interest rates by the Fed. That's not the kind of terrorism I'm talking about with respect to interest rates. So tune in to find out about that. And finally, please do occasionally visit my Patreon page. If you want to give a one-time contribution, that can be done on Patreon too. You just, say what the contribution will be, and then you cancel your Patreon after that, and then all you owe is the initial Patreon contribution. So you can fix it. So you do a one-time contribution with Patreon, but also I have a Buy Me a Coffee account, so you can please buy me a coffee. So please do that. And as I said, I will see you at 9 p.m. tonight. And tomorrow is Thursday, and we're also going to have some great stuff on various elections on Thursday, and some other very good stuff as well. So enjoy your evening. Hopefully, I'll see you later. Enjoy tomorrow when we'll have another 3 very good live streams to offer you. We're burning up on the web with these live streams. We've got 3 a day coming your way. Anyway, good night for now.